Hi everyone, welcome to SAMA. SAMA stands for Spooky Ask Me Anything, where we have an expert come on board to talk about the chosen subject. Today we have Jason Ringas to talk to us about Royal Rife again. He's going to talk about his equipment, his microscopes and more. More is quite a broad subject title, so feel free to ask any questions you like about the work that Royal Rife did during his time. Hi Jason, welcome back.
How you doing, John?
Yeah, I'm great. A little bit jet lagged. I mentioned a little bit earlier about my inability to sleep last night. I'm still in Poland time.
Yes.
Poland's a fantastic country. When we went there, we were expecting cold and snow, and we got 28-degree temperatures pretty much every day we were there. So that sort of blew away every sort of preconception we had on the place. Go there if you can. It's a really lovely place. They've got oceans. They've got everything. But welcome back, Jason. Now today's subject is Royal Rife, his microscopes, and his equipment, the various projects that he did during his lifetime. We've got some pre-arranged questions to get the SAMA started. The first question that this person was asked was, I really must have a larger font for these questions. But what was the magnification, Jason, of the Rife microscope? I've heard a lot about it, and I've heard that it's very, very powerful.
Yes, well, the different versions of the Rife microscope had different maximum magnifications. The largest, which was the universal microscope, the number 3, that had a maximum magnification of about 31,000 times, and Rife had said that they had boosted it up to, I think, 50 or 60,000 times. The other microscopes, they had less. I think the number 2, the number 4, and then had up to 17,000 maximum magnification, and I think the number 5 had a maximum of 15,000, and the first microscope, the number 1, had a maximum of 12,000, although that was not a prismatic microscope. That was his first one, where he had the barrel of the microscope filled with the glycerin rather than the prism system that he had went to after that.
That's so up to 71,000. You're saying the first one is 15,000. Do modern microscopes magnify 15,000?
No. The first one actually was 12,000.
Sorry, 12,000.
The average microscope is around, usually they work at 1,000 times, maybe 1,500. Sometimes they can boost them maybe 2,000 times magnification, because the general rule of thumb is 1,000 times the numerical aperture of the objective. So if you're using a top-of-the-line objective 100x with a numerical aperture of 1.4, then as the general rule of thumb is you would go to, say, 1,400. Usually they'll boost it maybe 1,600 times.
Okay. There's quite a few USB microscopes which can be purchased quite cheaply. They go to, I guess, around 1,000, or maybe they can boast more with digital magnification. Are those microscopes any use for magnifying cells?
Yeah, they can be useful for some basic work. If you're doing research level work, then obviously not, because it's not just a question of magnification. You have to also have the resolution as well. So in theory, you can magnify as much as you want, but that doesn't mean you're going to see anything extra. So that's actually, there's 3 legs to forming a good microscope image. You have to have magnification, you have to have lateral resolution, which is the ability to distinguish 2 points side by side as individual points rather than having them blurred into one. And then you have to have contrast. So if you're missing any one of those legs, it's not going to work out. As an example, say you have an electron microscope and you're looking at a virus, but you're only magnifying 40 times. Well, it's an electron microscope that has resolution, but without that extra magnification, you're not going to see it. So, or you could have magnification and resolution, but if you have no contrast, it'll be like looking through a glass window. So all three factors are important to seeing an organism or anything else under the microscope.
And Royal Rife's microscopes, they were very high resolution as well as high magnification, weren't they?
Absolutely. The so-called BX virus, as he called it, has been calculated to be 50 nanometers by 66 nanometers. The late Professor Hubbard did some calculations on the tetanus spore, and he claimed that it was actually showing 44 angstrom resolution. As a matter of fact, when he showed some micrographs from the universal microscope to a colleague, the colleague thought they were nothing special, that they were electron micrographs. And then when he told them that they were made with a light microscope, and he immediately claimed, oh, this is fraudulent, because he couldn't believe that a light microscope would produce that kind of resolution. But the fact of the matter is that electron microscopes didn't have the capability that's shown in those micrographs at the time that they were taken in the 1930s. The electron microscope advanced in ability, I think, later in the 1950s.
That's astounding. So he was way ahead of his time then, wasn't he, with what he'd built?
Well, absolutely. The things that it could show back then. There are techniques nowadays that can show high resolution, but back then there was nothing that could match it.
Right. So how did Royal Rife perform this magic? You threw two technical terms at me. You threw glycerine and you threw prisms. If you can explain in more detail, please.
Well, whenever light transfers from one medium to another, the rays refract, right? And so he was trying to keep control of the light rays, because when the rays cross, they interfere with each other and cause destructive interference, and that destroys the resolution. And that is actually what the whole basis of what he was trying to do, was control the light rays so that the resolution that's at the object doesn't degrade by the time it gets to the eye point.
Okay. I didn't actually realize when two light beams intersect, they interfere with each other, so that the result, when they come out the other side, they've changed. Is that
yes?
What you mean?
Actually, if you know about the phase contrast microscope, they actually intentionally use that interference. They shift the phase of the light rays to produce contrast, but that's a controlled kind of thing. Whereas with a regular microscope, where you don't have any real control over the light rays, that is, Rife said that, the skeptics, they say that they quote the textbooks about resolution and all this kind of thing, as if Rife wasn't aware of it, right? He says, but this introduces other methods. And just like modern microscopes, such as the near field optical microscope, there's a few other modern techniques that they use different methods, and they surpass the so-called theoretical limits of resolution. And Rife was essentially doing the same thing.
Right. Now, what was the function of glycerine in the microscopes?
Well, just so that the light, as it's going from the glass in the objectives to the eyepiece, so that it wouldn't refract as much, right? Instead of going into air, it just the refractive index of the glycerin closely matched the the glass objectives.
Okay, so it's less refraction between the different surfaces if
Yes,
it wasn't
I don't even think he was the only one to ever do that. There may have been others that did something similar.
Right. So where did Royal Rife learn how to do this? Because we didn't.
I don't know about that. It's I think there is some people that have done some research. I think there's ideas in the textbooks of the time that obviously he was very well informed about these matters. So I'm sure that he got ideas through his studies, and having his mechanical fabrication capabilities, it just all came together.
Because he had the full workshop facilities, didn't he? So he had the lathe and other machining equipment.
Yes, he was completely equipped to fabricate pretty much any kind of equipment that he wanted.
Has anyone, have any of his microscopes, working microscopes, survived?
As we mentioned last time, some of the microscopes still exist, but none of them are operational. I had heard that there was some effort to get the universal microscope back in working operation, but I haven't heard what the status of that is.
Mm. Has anyone tried to copy his microscopes?
Actually, I've just recently learned that if I understand correctly, Stan Truman and Eric Rowley have essentially recreated the Rife microscope and have been awarded patent protection. I don't know if they're using exactly the techniques, but from what little I read in the patents, it sounds like the Rife microscope. So that I just learned that recently because I haven't been in touch with Stan in several years, so I haven't heard what the status was because he was working on that for years. But it appears that they have succeeded in essence, replicating the Rife microscope.
If the microscope is a copy of the original Royal Rife microscope, it wouldn't be able to have a patent. So they must have modified it in some way.
Well, the Rife microscope was never patented itself, and so yeah, I don't know how that all works out, and I would imagine that even if it was patented, the patents would have expired. But I think that they may have done something a little differently. I'm not sure, but in principle, they did in one of the patents. I think they showed some images of 50 nanometer colloidal gold particles.
Yes,
So that's the resolution that we're looking for. So it looks like they've done it.
it certainly seems like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, Royal Rife was doing the microscopes quite early in his time, wasn't he? When he was quite young.
Yes.
And
Well,
I believe that
go ahead.
he used the microscopes for his subsequent frequency work.
Yes, the original microscope, the number one, he had built in the 1920s. And because the standard research microscopes couldn't resolve what he was looking to resolve, and so that's why because he said I was up against a stone wall. He goes, I couldn't go any farther with the standard research microscopes, and that's why he out of necessity had to build his own microscope.
He wasn't one to wait around and ask other people to do things, was he? He sort of got down and did the work himself.
Well, the vast majority of people will quote you the textbook and say that it's impossible. So, the people that say it's impossible shouldn't get in the way of the people doing it.
That's right. The impossible usually is possible. It just takes a bit more time.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, the questions then went on to harmonics. They weren't mincing words. The first question being, what are harmonics? I guess maybe an introduction on, yeah.
Well,
Well,
harmonics are just merely multiples of a given frequency. So say you have a frequency of 100 hertz. So then the second harmonic would be 200. The third harmonic would be 300 hertz, and so on down the line. And as they go, they diminish in intensity. Yeah, that's just the basic idea of harmonics.
right. There's a bit of a disparity between different countries. Engineers in one country are taught that like 200 is the first harmonic, the first one being the fundamental,
Well, no,
and 300.
yeah, my understanding is that the fundamental is called the first harmonic. So there's,
Yes.
in essence, there's no such thing as a first harmonic because it's the fundamental. And so the down the line, it starts with the second and goes on from there.
Okay. Now the word harmonic appears very often in the Royal Rife literature, and for good or for good or for bad, it's been used for many different purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one of the reasons, I guess, why I wasn't sleeping too well last night, just thinking through several issues. Why do people use harmonics with their equipment?
Well, because probably to get around the limitations of the particular equipment they're using. I mean, 20 years ago at the very first Rife conference in Vancouver Island, they were talking about harmonics back then. And I just said, well, if it's a harmonic, why not just use that frequency directly? And I still say the same thing today. Yeah, so it seems like fundamentally the reason for using harmonics is to circumvent the limitations of the particular machine. It seems like a lot of the discussion about harmonics is almost, I get the impression that they're trying to avoid doing the grunt work of actually hunting for actual MORs. So they just want to splatter the spectrum with harmonics and then hope that they'll hit a frequency in that harmonic spectrum.
Do you think harmonics can be used for decreasing the time it takes to find an MOR, which is the fundamental? Perhaps you can.
If we're talking about Rife research, my opinion, harmonics are a big red herring. There's endless discussion on harmonics and that, if you just use this audio frequency with this carrier wave and pick out this harmonic sideband or heterodyne these frequencies and, choose that harmonic or use this subharmonic it's, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, why not just hunt and find the correct MOR, verify it, and use it? I mean, Rife would never have intentionally used a harmonic or a subharmonic. If he had known that one of his frequencies was not the true frequency and he found the true frequency, then he would just use that one. And he even said it. He said if we had to, he speculated. He said it's possible that some of the frequencies I found may be harmonics. And he was referring to subharmonics. He says if we had the true frequency, it would work better because there'd be more power in it. And so my position is, why not hunt for the fundamental?
Okay. To the non-technical people watching this video, can you explain how harmonics are created?
The only waveform, to my understanding, that doesn't have harmonics is a pure sine wave. So, the smooth flowing sine wave. If it's pure, then it doesn't have harmonics. even a little bit of distortion of that sine wave, right away you get some harmonics. All other types of waves, such as a square wave, according to theory, it's composed of an infinite series of harmonics with the fundamental. And that's how you get the square shape. So any kind of distorted waveform of any type will have harmonics.
So it sounds like harmonics are easy to get, but it's harder to not have them.
Yes, I don't think it's necessarily a big deal to have some harmonics in a waveform. But the question is that if you are trying to produce the so-called Rife effect with harmonics, then I say, well, why not just use the fundamental? Because I don't think very many people appreciate the logarithmic scale. When they do spectrum analysis of waveforms and they point to these harmonics and everything, I don't think they appreciate just how little power there is in those harmonics. It looks like it's a big issue, and in radio communications, it's important to suppress harmonics because when the receiver gets it, it has amplifiers in it, and it's going to amplify those noisy harmonics. So that's a problem there. But in Rife research, if you're trying to project power to a target, certain bacteria, and dissipate power in that target, harmonics, I don't think are the way to do it.
Right. We did touch on this in the previous SAMA that we had maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true where I guess it helps boost sales where you can see this broad spectrum of power spread across a broad area.
Yeah.
But as Jason says, that if you view the same graph using a linear scale instead of a logarithmic scale, you'll see that anything out from the center, which is the fundamental, or the first harmonic.
Because the whole idea of the logarithmic scale is so that you can show on the same graph very weak signals with very intense signals. But like you said, if you just click the button and switch to a linear scale, all that so-called harmonic spectrum that looks like there's a lot of power there, that all disappears.
Right. And so the harmonics haven't got the power to do the job necessarily.
No, like let's use an example, for instance. Jim Baer did a spectrum analysis on his device, and he posted some spectrograms, not the waveforms, the spectrums. And he showed the fundamental carrier and then the two primary sidebands. And they were 20 decibels down. The first sidebands were 20 decibels down. Now, 20 decibels down, if just say the carrier was 100 watts, 20 decibels down from 100 watts is 1 watt. And then all the rest of the harmonics were 50 or 60 decibels down. Well, that's just noise. That's in the noise floor. So, and the same thing with all the other spectrographs that Jeff Garf has done, and even Anthony's, even though his was full of spectral leakage and aliasing. But if you just graph, because usually it's scaled in 10 decibels per division. So you can see right on those spectrographs, 20, 30, 40 decibels down. Well, there's no power there.
No, that's right. So most of the powers going in the frequencies which aren't being used, they're not anywhere near the frequency that you want, and light and noise and heat.
Yeah. Well, and then I suppose we have to ask the question, what is the minimum power level to, as Rife said, do the business? Now, if you can do the business with a harmonic that's 30 decibels down, so it's got, say, 1 milliwatt of power, well, why not build a frequency generator of 1 milliwatt and use it as a fundamental? And that way you avoid all that problem with potential interference or anything like that. It'd be much safer as well.
Now you threw one idea at me just recently, and I've built this into the next version of Spooky. You're talking about having a harmonic supporting a fundamental. So you might have one frequency, one 512th of the fundamental. So they're both simultaneously being sent to the transmission device, be it plasma or whatever.
Well, this is actually in the theoretical, hypothetical stage, but Jim Armstrong, who's one of the few true Rife researchers, he came up with this idea and did some computer simulations. And what he had done is he modeled, say, the bacteria as a resonant circuit. And he chose components so that it would resonate in the range of, just say, 400, 416 kilohertz. So then he started testing different signals against that to see what kind of power transfer you would get. So when you hit it with its resonant frequency, 416 kilohertz, you get a response in the target just a little bit reduced. So if you feed a signal, say 800 volts peak to peak, I think it responded with the certain parameters that he input, it responded at, I think, 600 volts. So then what he did is he took an audio frequency, which was a harmonic, subharmonic of the carrier, and as a gating frequency, and he fed that in, and it actually, the target responded with, I think, like 1300 volts peak to peak. So it actually, it looks like the harmonically related audio frequency was pumping more energy into the target. So then what he did is, okay, so now let's keep that audio frequency, but change the carrier, and right away the resonance was destroyed. So there was no resonance. So then he tried, okay, put back the resonant carrier, but put a non-harmonic gating frequency, and the resonance was destroyed as well. So it seems at the very least, to do the business for MOR research, you either have to use a straight carrier, or if you're going to modulate or gate that carrier, it has to be a harmonically related audio frequency of that.
Right.
So this is all in the works right now. Jim is working on a circuit to test this out, and I'm kind of excited about it because it all makes sense, at least on paper. Now it needs to be tested on actual bacteria. Yes.
I've, as I mentioned, I've written a preset with all the parameters set and a new waveform to provide a 512th of the fundamental, and I can tell you, Jason, that something definitely happens.
Yeah.
It changes Spooky Central quite a lot. It's quite an improvement on previous presets which I've written. So
Yeah.
I owe you a thank you for this.
Well,
Yeah, it certainly seems more effective.
You owe Jim Armstrong a thank you, because it's all his baby. He just shared that with me, and I had asked him if he wanted me to pass the paper around, and he said absolutely. So yeah, credit for that idea. Credit goes completely to Jim Armstrong. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
It's a keeper. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. What I think the gating is good for is plasma, which, when plasma is not ionized, it needs a striking voltage, which is a bit of a spike.
Yeah.
And I think that's beneficial for treatments.
Yes, and I think also the idea with the audio gating frequencies is also to help de-ionize the plasma between pulses. So I think that's also a fact. Well, as I was saying earlier, the 512 divisor, it doesn't have to be divided by 512. It could be another divisor. It just has to be a harmonic multiple of the carrier, and you have to have the resonant frequency of the target. And then, as we were saying about the audio frequencies, it appears that one of the big benefits is it helps when you have it pulsed and cut up into little snippets like that. That helps de-ionize the plasma between pulses, and so it produces more like of an impulse effect rather
Right.
than a continuous kind of effect.
I chose 512, Jason, because it brings it close to a supposed audio frequency that was used by Royal Rife of around 3,300 hertz, and running at 1604 brings it in that range. And also 512 is a nice, it's half of 1024, which is the number of data points within the waveform of speaking. So that's worked out quite nicely for two good reasons.
Yeah, and this is all still experimental, and it needs to be tried out. That's all. Try it out and see how it. And it could even be beneficial for the whole harmonic audio can be beneficial for the fixed carrier systems as well. So if they just measure their carrier wave, and then divide it down, and then use frequencies that are exact divisors of the carrier. Because here's another observation that has been made with the beam ray AZ58 style of system, because it's like an unstable carrier because of the low Q tank circuit. The carrier actually shifts and locks on to the nearest multiple of the audio frequency. So it actually, the beam ray type of system is actually already trying to do that sort of a thing.
Was there any capacitive coupling between the tube and the patient with that type of equipment?
Well, from what I understand, if you bring your hand or any object, it shifts the carrier. Different lead lengths to the plasma tube, objects, people, that sort of thing. All of that shifts the carrier a little bit. So that brings into question the hypotheses about harmonics and that sort of thing. If the carrier is shifting and randomly, say it shifted a little bit different for each patient, then how are you going to calculate harmonics, without, and they didn't have spectrum analyzers back then. So there's some issues with and that's why it's better to just run the fundamental, because you know what you're running.
How did Royal Rife know if he was applying a fundamental or a subharmonic of the fundamental?
Yeah, he didn't. And that's why he speculated that it was certainly possible that some of the frequencies he found were subharmonics. But if he knew absolutely, then he would have just used the fundamental, right? Because he said none of the frequencies that I found so far are in the ultra short range. We can, if we take that at face value, then that would imply that he tested the ultra short range of frequencies. Or he could have just been making a general statement. But when Rife mentioned harmonics and that some of his frequencies might have been harmonics, he wasn't stating that as a statement of fact. He was just it was a statement of speculation that it was certainly possible that could have been the case. Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to talk a bit about plasma tubes as an antennae. Now, Henry Siner, who was the assistant of Royal Rife, He passed a comment, it was just a comment, where you could use a normal radio transmitter for the frequencies rather than jumping through all the loops of matching characteristics and the circuitry involved in driving a plasma tube. Do you think, and Royal Rife said, that's a great idea, but do you think that would work if you use a normal radio transmitter?
Well, that the only real way would be to test it. If you think about it, if that was the case, then why aren't we all cured with all the radio transmitters that we're surrounded by with the modern technology? And, there's frequencies. You have AM radio transmitters all over the place. You have shortwave radio transmitters. You have Wi-Fi transmitters. You have transmitters all over the place. As a matter of fact, a lot of people get actually sick from all these, electromagnetic waves that are, saturating the environment. So I suppose in theory, it could be possible. As we mentioned, I think last time, diathermy uses some insulated pads where they just, they call them condenser pads. So you have an electric field going from one pad to the other, and they have different spacing. And, when I have a few diathermy machines here, you just, fold up a few towels to get a different spacing, and then the field goes through the target area and heats it up. You could possibly do the same thing with bacteria as well.
Okay, but Royal Rife chose plasma tubes, and I've always been wondering why he chose something that's so hard to drive. If you're putting the same signal into a piece of wire, whether the effect would be the same. But I came to realize that plasma tubes are, they've got an electric field and a magnetic field, but they have other fields as well. And these other fields are emissive fields. They don't absorb, they only go in one direction.
Yes, well, they if you research waves in plasmas, there's all kinds of waves that can be produced. They have electromagnetic waves of different types, and they have electrostatic waves of different types. And now, I don't know what of those waves can actually extend outside of the glass envelope of the plasma tube, but there's even ultrasound, just straight ultrasound it could be an ultrasonic transducer as well. But there's a lot of different things that could be going on there that makes it certainly an interesting subject of study. But as I mentioned last time, his initial concept was based upon X-ray. So and that's why he used X-ray tubes. So he didn't want to produce X-rays. He wanted to produce some sort of ray, and that was conceptually where he was coming from. So now, whether you actually need the plasma tube, I think that that still needs to be determined once and for all.
Right. Now, many people today are using sine waves for driving their plasma tubes, which is the carrier, and they're modulating above that. For many of the fields, the plasma tube will be doubling the frequency because it's emitting both in the positive part of the cycle and the negative part of the cycle. But the resultant will be like a bunny hop of the field, and it won't be, would that be conducive to inducing resonance, do you think, in a cell?
Well, if you don't have the resonant frequency, you're not going to get resonance. So, I think that the fixed carrier systems work on a fundamentally different principle. I think as a general statement, I try to distinguish between what I call physiologic frequency therapy and germicidal or MOR frequency therapy. So you could, have an overlap, in some cases, but that's why in vitro research is so important, because you could be getting effects on a physiologic level that may even cause the destruction of microorganisms, but that's not necessarily through the same mechanism as what Rife was doing. Because it's just, for instance, say you have a machine that is therapeutically effective. You get clinical results and everybody is happy. But then you test it under the microscope and it doesn't destroy the microorganisms. Well, then that's evidence that it's something different than what Rife was doing, because Rife started in the laboratory and then went on to in vivo research with animals and humans. If he had never got any results under the microscope, he wouldn't have been able to proceed further. So
Right.
at least at this juncture, it appears that there's something fundamentally different about what Rife was doing and what we're generally doing with our frequency machines today. That doesn't mean that they're bad. That doesn't mean they don't work. It's just something different, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that.
Right.
I've always been baffled at the seeming obsession with people in calling everything that uses frequencies a Rife machine. It's okay to not be Rife, right? The only time it's not okay is when you're calling it Rife and it's not Rife. It's okay if it's not a Rife machine. If it works, it works. It stands on its own merits.
But you can always jump on a bandwagon, I guess, that in sort of
Well, yeah,
yeah. What can you say?
yeah.
Now, Royal Rife's tubes. I know that he used quite a different combination of tubes. Did he ever use a straight tube?
Not to my knowledge. His tubes had internal electrodes. Yeah, they were modeled. Some were actual X-ray tubes, and then the other ones that were custom fabricated were modeled on that pattern with the internal electrodes and the 45-degree target as well.
With the tubes which have got the 45 degree target, in one half of the cycle the plasma will hit the target and then bounce off, and the other side of the cycle it won't be emitting so strongly, would it?
Well, if in fact there is some sort of directional effect being produced by that target, well then, if when it reverses polarity and then strikes the perpendicular target, then you're just going to get a scattering effect. Whereas when it hits the angled target, you'll get a deflection effect and sort of shoot out towards the target.
So in that configuration, the plasma tube won't be a frequency doubler then. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if it actually is doubling the frequency. I mean, that's what they say it's doing. Whether it's acting as a diode, I don't think that's the case. I mean, we simply don't know, even if the whole concept is correct, that it's acting as a partially directional antenna. Some people have said there does seem to be something different going, but other people are saying that you get the same kind of electric field effect off the wires feeding to the plasma tube. So you have to be taking those kinds of measurements. I don't think it's a trivial matter.
Mm. It is true. A lot of electrical noise does come off the high tension leads going through the tube.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the tube introduces its own harmonics with its waveform distortion.
Yeah, that's why it's also important to try and use the leads the way that they shortwave, where they use the ladder line, they try to keep them as parallel as possible so that the fields will interact and, you know, try and cancel each other out. You know, I think that's important to follow that kind of pattern.
That's right. The leads going through the tube, because the voltage is so high, it's basically a very long capacitor, and it changes the characteristics of the tube. If the wires are touching, then the capacitance gets increased and the waveform will change. The sharp edges will disappear, and well, if there are any sharp edges, but the waveform does get distorted quite a bit.
Yeah.
You
Yeah, I
know.
mean, this is all, you know, electronic and radio engineering. There's an enormous amount of information, and I think that people that build machines should make use of the knowledge and information that exists, so that the machines are built properly, that they don't radiate, you know, as unnecessarily, you know, that sort of thing.
Just talking about the radiation side, a few Rife machines use 27 megahertz as the carrier because it's that frequency band is allowed for experimentation use. But if we're trying to target a cell that responds to a different frequency, then harmonics have to be created from the carrier in the form of side bands or whatever you want to call it. But then it gets out from the allocated 27 megahertz space. So do you think the machines that use 27 megahertz as a carrier are effective?
Yes, they actually are. They are effective, and they've been in use for a long time. And don't forget, it's not only those machines, but most diathermy machines that also use pulse diathermy, they work in that range as well. And those have been used for decades. But there's a fundamental different thing that we're looking for. I mean, you know, if you're talking about Rife research and you're trying to replicate the so-called Rife effect, then you have to use whatever frequency is going to do the business. It doesn't matter where the frequency is. You know, if it turned out that Rife's, you know, AM range frequencies were actually subharmonics, and then it turns out that the actual frequencies are a little bit higher, well, then those are the frequencies that should be used. If you need to use some sort of shielding or whatever else to make sure that you're not overstepping the bounds, that's okay. The one good thing about 27 megahertz is that its allocated bandwidth is the widest. And so even if you're splattering an enormous amount, if you did get outside of the band, those harmonics would be so weak that there would be no problem anyway. So
Okay.
yeah, and usually, like for instance, the Jim Bear system, it uses an antenna tuner, and that has a certain bandwidth as well. That's going to, you know, prevent, you know, ultra wide band harmonics from getting out of control. So, those machines have been used for a long time now. I mean, and people have been getting results. I don't think people would use any machine for a particularly long period of time if there wasn't some positive results. And you know, those machines have been continued to be developed and improved, and efficacy is even better than they were back when it all started out.
Right. What frequency did Royal Rife go up to in his experiments?
The best information that we have is that he was actually using radio receivers as oscillators, as frequency generators. And they had a maximum frequency range of about 2 megahertz. Now, there's been endless speculation that the actual frequencies were higher up in harmonics and that sort of thing, but the frequency that frequencies that he was feeding into the machine, into the plasma tube, were up to 2 megahertz.
Okay. Did Philip Hoyland, the engineer that he hired to make his machines, to improve his machines, did he manage to take it any higher than 2 megahertz?
Well, first, I'm not actually sure that Philip Hoyland was an engineer. That's just an aside, but we always call him the engineer. And I suppose you could call him an engineer because he did design some of those machines. But
Okay.
but he ran a radio repair shop before he got involved with Rife. If he was a real engineer, I don't know if he would have been doing that line of work. So that's just a side point that sometimes we just take things at face value without critically analyzing them. But anyway, back to the topic. He was the one that developed the machines, like the number 4 machine that he built for Rife went up to 22 megahertz. So, we don't know how far they experimented in that range, but it did have the capability to go up to 22 megahertz. Then the later beam ray machines that he had built had a so-called fixed carrier in the 3 to 4 megahertz range. So they were, higher than what Rife did initially.
Okay. So it's possible that Royal Rife was finding subharmonics. It is possible, and the frequencies, the true frequencies, the fundamentals, were higher than he could reach on his equipment.
Well, that's certainly possible, but on the other hand, there was frequency generators available at the time. There was no technological limitation for him using frequency generators that could go higher than those Cole and Kennedy machines. So why did he use those and stick to that range? We don't know. That's why this all needs to be tested out. Even if we knew absolutely that that one frequency that Rife used was the frequency, we still have to verify it today because we don't know if it's going to work today. So it all has to be tested out. It doesn't matter if we had a master frequency list straight from Rife himself that's been preserved. It all still has to be tested and verified.
Right, done scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
I guess with if the equipment being used to produce the frequencies are different, that may have an effect also on the frequencies that are being, it might need to be that for that particular device, this is the sweet spot frequency to produce the result.
That is certainly a possibility. I mean, Rife said in the court trial, he said, we have a given wavelength which can be produced in different waves, but it should be the same no matter how it's produced. So like a resonant frequency is a resonant frequency. It doesn't matter what machine you use to generate it. But it has to be confirmed.
Right. Going back to 27 megahertz machines, which have got a carrier that's quite a bit higher than most other plasma machines out there, which use around the 3 megahertz generally mark. They overmodulate the ones that I know about. They overmodulate the carrier, so it's almost like a hard switching on and off of the carrier. For a lot of if you liken the resonance to a pendulum swinging, if you're applying a very high frequency in 2 directions to a pendulum, it's not going to move. But if it's unidirectional, even no matter how fast the carrier is, if it's being switched on and then off and then on at the frequency of resonance, then that would have a biological effect. And this is why I'm coming back to the plasma being an emissive device rather than truly AC, where it can only the field that's having the effect on the cell is only doing the pushing. It can't draw in again after the on the other part of the cycle, because I can't see myself how a 27 megahertz carrier could have an effect on an organism that's got a lower fundamental MOR. I'd be interested to know your comments on that.
Well, see, we're also talking about physiologic effects and physiologic mechanisms. So even if, like, we know that 27 megahertz diathermy machines, they have effects. They have pulse diathermy as well. They
Yes.
have effects, and it could be some more generalized thermal effect. There could be there's a lot of different things that could be going on as an explanation for why they get the clinical results that they do. Now, if we're talking strictly about resonating a targeted microorganism, we don't know. I mean, some theories about the DNA in the bacteria, that it's like a half-wave dipole, and that it's in the like microwave range, and so that it's actually the frequencies that is being produced by those machines, it's actually the higher harmonics in the microwave range that are resonating it. I don't know if that is correct or not. There's so many different things that could be going on. And that's why I think it's important to do in vitro research, especially, when we're talking about Rife, because when you're doing it in vitro, then you're completely eliminating all the physiologic mechanisms that could be happening to the human or animal body. And that's why the fundamental Rife effect is something different than what we seem to be getting with the machines we use today.
Okay. Diathermy pads, are they AC or pulsed DC?
That is actually like just a radio frequency electric field. Yeah. And they have, the patient actually becomes part of the tuning. So they get sandwiched in between, and then they have a tuning capacitor, and then you just tune it to get the certain current flow that you want through the circuit. Yeah, the vintage ones that I have, they're pretty crude machines, but they do what you need them to do.
Okay, so I guess they must be AC then if the patient becomes part of the capacitive.
Yeah,
Okay.
because you have to even you have to be careful, because if you hit high voltage DC, you could kill someone if something goes wrong and they actually get if the insulation fails or something like that, and you hit them with 1,000, 1,500 volts of DC, that could be problematic.
Would be painful. So the diathermy pads, have they got quite good protection for to safeguard people from electrocution?
Yes, really thick rubber. The ones that I've seen. There's another type called Schlieffake pads, and they're round metallic discs, and then they're inside like a glass envelope, and you can even adjust the distance. I think those are higher efficiency than the rubber coated diathermy pads. Yeah, I've never actually used those, but they would be something interesting to try out.
Were these pads used before plasma tubes were used?
Yes. As a matter of fact, another Rife researcher, Jim Peters, when he first started out, he was using just a modified diathermy machine. So he just put a modulation circuit into it to run the different frequencies, and he was using the insulated diathermy pads, and very effective for pain relief in Lyme disease. when he was using some of the higher frequencies, it does seem to keep the infections at bay. But I remember the last time he told me that if you don't use it for a couple of weeks, then it sort of comes back. So there's something still, despite all the positive results that they have had, there seems to be something lingering in the background, just waiting for an opportunity to rear its ugly head again.
Lyme seems to be a tough beast. We had Sebastian Mercier on just 2 summers ago talk about his experience with Lyme and how he managed to overcome Lyme. But if he doesn't do regular maintenance, even now, his symptoms can gradually return again. So let's hope that we can find something to totally overcome Lyme.
Yeah.
Bit of a nasty one.
It does appear to be a tough nut to crack. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions gone through and all the things that I had in mind to discuss. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about, Jason, before we pull the plug?
No, I don't. Not offhand. If any of the viewers have any questions, we could certainly try to answer them.
Sure. It's we didn't get any questions from our online viewers, but maybe they're busy enjoying the summer sun, and or maybe we're answering their questions. You're answering the questions fully, and you don't need to ask any more questions, which is always a good sign.
Or maybe we're so boring that they clicked off.
That's what I love about you, Jason. You're so positive. Yeah.
But there are, I think, there's plenty of research that needs to be done, because here's, I thought about this actually. Most people in the so-called Rife community are Rife consumers, not Rife researchers. And that's okay, because not everybody can be a Rife researcher. It's not that easy to do. I myself, I haven't done work under the microscope in many years. But we need to have more people actually doing work under the microscope. I mean,
right.
the amount of energy that has been expended in endless debates, such as the issue of harmonics. I mean, if a fraction of that was expended actually hunting for MORs, I'm sure we'd have a few by now, some that's verified, rather than people just saying, well, I felt this effect, therefore it works. Right? I mean, we need to follow up and stick to Rife's methodology, or else we'll never be sure. Like way back in 1999, the late Don Tunney, we were talking at the Rife conference, and he said something to the effect, thanking me for keeping him honest in saying that he doesn't have a Rife machine. And I said, well, you might have a Rife machine, we just don't know, right? And that's the whole point of research. There's a lot of machines out there that may qualify to be called a Rife machine, but we don't know, because we don't have the confirmation. And that's what it's all about. And no amount of discussion on harmonics and sidebands and all that is going to change the need for objective confirmation, which is laboratory experimentation. There's no getting around that.
We've had, 70 years of arguing about harmonics and sidebands. I think there's a few too many armchair researchers and not enough people actually doing hands-on. We've had a question come in from Freedom. Freedom asks about the mechanical drawings and measurements of the Rife microscopes. Did Did any of Rife microscopes have plans, drawings of the internals?
There are some drawings. I think John Crane had done some drawings as well. I don't know how accurate they all were. I have some things about the lenses, but it's kind of hard to make sense of it all. Like without having the broader context, See, that's another criticism that I have of Rife, is that he should have done a better job of preserving his legacy. He could have published all of his information in a monograph. After he had closed his lab down and retired, he could have just focused on, okay, things didn't work out as planned. I need to preserve this for posterity. He could have, on the audio interviews, he said that the prisms, the 90-degree prisms, he says they're not a true 90-degree prism. He says that'll be explained elsewhere. Well, where's the explanation elsewhere? So he could have published something, putting out the information, 100%, so that somebody in the future, would be able to replicate his work. He didn't do that, and he left it up. He left his legacy to John Crane, and John Crane simply wasn't qualified to carry the torch. I mean, we have to thank him for preserving what has been preserved, but you need somebody with a higher level of qualification to carry on where Rife left off.
Why were his microscopes destroyed intentionally? You said there's no working microscopes now.
We don't really know. I heard that one of them was actually either cannibalized or cut up. They were trying to analyze it, so they cut it up. Or I don't know how accurate that account is, but maybe over time, people they couldn't get it to work. They didn't know how to set it up, so maybe parts were cannibalized for other things. Yeah, we don't really know. The only way you would know is if a working model shows up someday, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
No, it's been quite a long time. A microscope of that caliber would need to be maintained, I assume, to keep it functional.
Yeah, and actually, if there are modern advancements in microscope technology that can do what we need to do, then it ultimately becomes irrelevant. Sure, it'd be nice for nostalgic purposes to have an original Rife microscope, but our goal is to simply see these viruses and other ultra microscopic particles in the living state, so that we can confirm whether the frequencies are devitalizing them. So if you could do that, if the new Stan Truman, what do they call it? The Truman nanoscope, I think they call it. If that does the job, and if they put it out on the market at a affordable price, then people can buy that and use it for research.
That would certainly help.
There are some techniques where you might not need to use a microscope. For instance, this one doctor friend of mine, who's also he's into Rife, and he's an infectious disease specialist, but he's also into ham radio, and he came up with this other idea, which kind of works almost hand in hand with Jim Armstrong's idea, to use what's called a grid dip oscillator to test for resonance on a sample of bacteria. So he said, you said you'll need maybe like a 3 or 4 gram pellet of the bacteria, So you'd have to culture maybe 1 or 2 liters of culture, and then you spin it down and wash it. Standard techniques that they always use with the phosphate buffered saline solution, wash it out, and then spin it down so it's a nice, fresh, moist pellet. And then you can use that and test with the grid dip oscillator to test for resonance. Um, if that works, we don't know if it works. It may not be sensitive enough. These are all just working ideas that at least have potential. But if you could take a test tube of bacteria and somehow put it through some kind of scanning device, find the resonant frequency, and then feed that through your frequency instrument, maybe with a harmonically related gate frequency, well, that might be the whole solution right there. We don't know. You just have to try it out and see what happens.
It's a brilliant idea, Jason. Can you explain to the non-technical viewers what a grid dip oscillator is and what it does?
Well, so it's an oscillator, and then they have, I have a vintage one somewhere stashed away here, but they have these coils, and they're used for detecting resonance in coils and tuned circuits, that sort of thing for radios, when you want to build a radio for testing components. So then this doctor friend, he came up with the idea of using that to test for resonance. So my idea, a little bit of a refinement there, is to make the coil use the actual type of test tube you're going to use with it, and use that as a form for the coil so that the coupling is as tight as possible. So you actually slide it into the coil, and then you can scan with frequencies. And there was an article in 1959, I think, Popular Electronics magazine, where you could use your signal generator to make a dip oscillator. So you could use a modern DDS generator with digital control and still get the same kind of effect.
It's a brilliant idea. I really hope it works.
Yeah,
because
it's a big if. It is a big if, but like I said, if it works, and then combine that with Jim Armstrong's idea of having you have the resonant frequency and the harmonically related gate frequency, so that you're pumping like a more intense field into the target. Another idea that I came up with is use that same kind of coil for the dip oscillator, but use a spectrum analyzer with a tracking generator. So that way you could scan the whole frequency range, and then if you get a dip, then that's your resonant point, and then you could also determine its minus 3 dB bandwidth as well, because you're going to probably have some variability in the individual bacteria. And so maybe you might have to like scan through like a narrow bandwidth to get them all. Those are just a few ideas, but it's a lot of work. I'm very well aware that talking about all this stuff is a whole lot easier than actually doing it.
Yes, well, we've got projects underway which will possibly realize a lot of this, but it's taking a lot of time because it takes a long time to do the impossible.
Yeah.
We were saying at the beginning,
Yeah.
we're 2 years in one of our projects and still going strong, but we're now seeing the light now. So it's hard work.
Yeah, I think like I said last time, this whole thing isn't beyond the reach. We know, we're talking about resonance. As Rife said, it's a coordinative resonance. So if that's the general idea, we all understand what that's all about. We understand, what we're trying to accomplish. So now it's just a matter of going about and like Rife said, he said, hunt and try. That's all we could do, right? He had to work sometimes months to find a single frequency. My opinion, we should be able to do that much faster with modern technology. If some of these ideas that we've been discussing actually pan out, then it just becomes a matter of getting access to the different types of microorganisms, right?
Mm.
So yeah, that's it just needs to be done, right? You know, we gotta set aside the debates about harmonics and hunt and try for some MORs.
Mm. Yeah, real research. Sometimes I get the feeling that people are so fixed in how Royal Rife did it, they're not willing to sort of think in broader terms and think, well, what we have now, the equipment that we have, and the new, what's been learned between then and now, if we applied that if we build on what Royal Rife did, but apply it in a different way, the results may be even greater or more readily obtained.
That's
So
certainly possible. I mean, Jim Peters had pointed out once, maybe it was some kind of quirk in the type of circuits that were being used back then with vacuum tubes, that sort of thing. You know, that's certainly a possibility, but people have already had some positive results with modern type of frequency machines. So I would tend to think that there's just something fundamentally missing. We're either, we're just some little detail that I think we're missing, but we just have to try it out because the different configurations that might be possible are limited. There's only so many different things that Rife might have been doing back then. So
right.
if you try one configuration and it doesn't work, well, try a different configuration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's right. You've just got to keep thinking of the best way. Like your suggestion before about using a harmonic that's related to a fundamental to support that frequency. Nothing's proven, but I've tried it and it certainly seems to work very well. So it
Well,
needs to be
then,
verified, of course.
yeah, then we have to, in this context, we have to define what we mean by works well. Okay, now there's works in the sense of clinical efficacy, positive clinical results, but then there's works in the Rife context, meaning it devitalizes the bacteria in vitro.
That's
Right?
right.
So, it's a good start that you get some clinical effects because, people, even though these machines aren't toys and they have to be handled with respect, we generally consider them to be safe. They've been used for so many decades. The general idea is that they're safe. Some of the ways that they're being used today, I don't think is safe. That's just my opinion, but as a general idea, they're safe. So now it's a question of doing some research to verify MORs, because if we can do it with just one, then we know that we've recovered the basic idea, and then it's just a matter of further testing to find all the other frequencies that we need.
That's right. So we need more powerful microscopes.
Well,
More
to
people.
start, take a look at this one right here. This is, I used this one in some experiments. Cheap, low-cost microscope. It allows me, at the time I was using just common baker's yeast as a quick and dirty test sample, culturing it in white grape juice on my coffee table. Just something to have to put under the microscope to test frequencies with. You don't really need a whole lot more than that. Obviously, they have for a little bit more money, you can get something better than that. Those USB microscope cameras that you mentioned, maybe some of the better ones you could make good use of so that you don't have to strain your eyes looking through the eyepiece. And then you could hook up video recording systems, so that way you can just put a sample on there, scan through a range and videotape it, and then you can scan through the video to see if there was any effect. If you found an effect, then you can go back and pinpoint where it was. That way you don't have to destroy your eyesight the way Rife did with his.
Yeah. Now Royal Rife did use time-lapse photography, didn't he, for some of his work?
Some of the work that he did was time lapse. In the lab film, that wasn't time lapse. He just showed the sample under the microscope before and after. Yeah, so we have technology that's, if Rife was working today, I mean, he would probably set a sample and just go take a tea break and come back and see what happened.
Right. So again, applying what's available now, the technology of today, to make things easier and possibly more precise.
Absolutely. And like the frequency generators we have with digital control, because that's another thing with the harmonics and the frequency sweeps that we're doing, because not only do you have to have the correct frequency, you have to have a sufficient amount of power, which is undetermined at this point, and you have to have a sufficient dwell time. If you sweep through, if you have a high power and the right frequency, but you sweep through it so you're only exposing it for 1 millisecond, well, that's probably not going to do anything. So you have to have all three of those factors. And now with they had frequency stability issues with some of the machines back then, and so the doctors came up with the idea of starting on one side of the dial and then slowly sweep through so that they could hit the frequency. Now they've taken that to an extreme where they're just scanning through the whole range. And I don't think that's the correct approach. You might have to sweep through the individual frequencies that you have, so it's a little bit on each side, but to sweep through the entire spectrum in the hopes that you'll be you're hitting and running it for 4 hours or overnight and that sort of thing. I don't think that's the correct approach when you're talking about MOR experimentation.
Right.
Maybe people are getting clinical results that way. I don't know. I do wonder whether the long-term effects will be positive, because this is electromagnetic energy that you're exposing the body to. It's supposed to be like a treatment, not a continuous exposure around the clock. Yeah. There was even a report from one guy that worked for one of the manufacturers, and working on the machines for so long a period of time, I think he became electrosensitive. Some sort of neurological damage. I'm not sure, but if you're working around these machines at high power for long periods of time, I don't think that's a good idea.
Many people, of course, have got Wi-Fi routers next to their desk as they're tapping away at the ivories. I guess the same thing could apply to them, where they could become sensitive.
Oh, there's a lot of people. There's been reports of students getting ill from the Wi-Fi in schools. Me, just as a precaution, I didn't have any health issues, but I just told my internet provider to turn the Wi-Fi off on the modem, and I just used the standard Cat5 cable. Works fine for me.
Right. Do you have smart meters in your side of town?
Yes, yeah, we have them too. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, where is our meter? I think it's over there down. So It's 20, 30 feet away from me where I'm sitting right now. But yeah, there's, and then it also depends on the individual. Some people don't have a problem with it, and other people that are more hypersensitive to that sort of thing, they get debilitated.
Mm.
Yeah.
The evidently the signal that's emitted by those meters is quite strong because the reader just drives past in his car and picks up the signal from quite a distance. So it is a true broadcasting device.
Oh yeah, yeah. So yeah, all these signals that we're being exposed to, I don't think it's a good thing. And so now you take essentially a radio transmitter, and then you're going to run it at high power, right close to you for 4, 6, 8 hours. I wonder about that. I you
Mm.
know I I don't treat any people or anything like that, but I would like to see some kind of information as to how that works for the long term.
Mm. Yeah, especially the more powerful machines, I suppose,
Mm,
the ones with
yeah.
the carrier.
Well, I mean, you had Rife giving a 3 to 5 minute treatment, twice a week. Okay, now say you have Lyme disease and you have more than one microorganism. So say you're doing 15-minute, half-hour treatment, every couple of days. Now that's totally different. Now you got people that are doing 2 or 3 treatments a day, every day.
Mm.
That doesn't, that, as far as I'm concerned, that's an indication that your machine isn't that effective. The more you have to use the machine, the less effective it is, right?
We
Because
need a one. Sorry, Jason.
yeah, if you're killing off the microorganisms, because also if you're killing microorganisms in your body, then all that debris is going to serve as an antigen for to kind of to tune up and charge up your immune system. So then your immune system might be able to get boosted to recognize those organisms, and then you'll sort of get a double whammy where you're killing them on the one hand with the frequency machine, but then the immune system is fighting them harder as well. Um, but running hours a day, like if you're killing the organisms, it should be in a few minutes.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, and you don't want to
Okay.
overdo it. Like, sure, Rife could have done, say, a half-hour treatment and then just kill too much off, and then you might injure the patient, right?
Mm. Mm. That's right. That's right. Okay. Well, we'll call this Summer to an end. We've overshot again.
Okay.
As always, it's lovely having you on board, Jason. I've learned quite a
Okay.
bit, and I'm sure our viewers have as well. So thank you for coming on,
Okay.
and thank you everyone for watching this SEMA.
Okay.
SEMA is a weekly program, so we'll be on next week. I believe we've got Clive DeCole back on next week. I'm not sure what their precise topic will be. It's something on nutrition. So thank you for viewing, and goodbye.
Okay. Cheers.